Well, it is a great pleasure and a great honor to welcome Eve Fairbanks on this show. She is a writer and a musician. We shall talk about both of that as well as the release of her latest book titled The Inheritors. How are you today, Eve? And welcome to
I'm,
this program.
I'm good. Nice to see you on a Sunday.
Yeah, happy Sunday to you too. So I wish to begin by asking you that, so you are originally from the United States and
Yes.
you moved to South Africa, which makes you the reverse Elon Musk. So tell us about,
All possible ways. Yeah.
growing up in the US and moving to where you are right now.
Yeah. So I grew up outside of Washington. My father worked for Reagan. He worked for the government, the State Department in the 80s. And so my family, right when I was born, moved to that area. And I grew up in the city, in a suburb outside of it. I never thought I would return to Washington after college, but I did. There's a huge influx in the US of journalists to Washington. So I remember reading, and I don't know what the figures would be now. I expect there would be more sort of extreme, but that the country as a whole lost about a third of its journalism jobs throughout the country, but they more than doubled in Washington. So I was part of that, I guess, in the mid 2000s, and I worked for some years as a congressional correspondent. But I mean, there's a thing in Washington where you show up to many press conferences and there's more journalists there than there are human beings of any kind. And the type of unspoken deals that you have to make with people in order to get tiny little scoops, et cetera. Anyway, I ended up wanting to leave and I moved to South Africa. I have to say, when I moved, which was in 2009, it was one of a couple of countries that I'd thought of moving to, that I'd read a lot about, but I hadn't been to, in order to learn languages, to just learn much more about the country and try to write something from there eventually. After I got to South Africa, I felt like, and I think this is just historically true, that it has a huge amount in common compared to other countries historically with the United States. So it was a really interesting comparison point.
I see. So how are you adjusting to life over there?
I've been here for 12 years and I lived in Kenya for 2 years in the middle. So it was like somebody once said about South Africa that it was the same equation as the United States and different variables, which may or may not be true, but you had a group of kind of settlers that split off from the British Empire, from Europe, tried to kind of assert a new identity in a place that they, on some levels, wished was empty, but wasn't. And so it was both very familiar, South Africa, and intense to live in. I mean, the people who even come from the US for short trips or who work here with the Peace Corps, I think they find that people discuss race way more than they do in any European country, in America, which seems maybe hard to imagine right now, but it's the case. There's much more discussion of that history and that reality, which can feel draining to people here. And it did a little bit for me, but it also, there's an element of relief to it because it's kind of out in the open.
I see.
It's a very, very beautiful country physically.
Yeah, I look forward to visiting it at some point.
Yeah, you should.
Yeah, so let's talk about you as a musician, because you've indicated in our email exchange that you participated in choral singing as a kid. So tell us about that.
Yeah, sorry. What is your musical background? I'm just curious.
I'm a great fan of music, but I have not played a musical instrument up
Oh,
until this point. So,
that's like my father. Gosh, he was one of the people I knew who loved music the most, and he listened to it with such passion and interest, but he never played an instrument. And I had a tiny bit of envy for him because he was never judging the performance from the perspective of somebody who had played an instrument. It was like a
right.
different, yeah. Yeah. So, but my mother was a piano teacher,
Mhm.
and she was a church organist, despite being our family's Jewish. But she played at a Christian Science church. She played at Lutheran. She was a musician, and so I studied the violin. I loved the violin. I just loved the kind of song-like aspect of it, and then I was also a singer. I tried opera, I tried musical theater. I never really had the volume. I never totally had the instrument. And I also was very afraid of performing solo. I had all of these dreams to kind of communicate wonderful music, so, solo songs that I really loved at recitals to people. And I would just get up on stage and it would all just like run out through my feet. But I ended up doing a lot of choral music, Anglican choral music, pretty specific tradition. So Bird, Tallis, Lassus, and I got to sing with some wonderful, wonderful church choirs and tour through England with Simon Carrington, who was in the King Singers. And I just really loved that type of music.
Wow.
Which does exist in South Africa because it has a British kind of Anglican tradition. Archbishop Desmond Tutu was an Anglican, yeah. But there's an element of economy in music, and you got these professional, semi-professional choirs. Remember in DC, we had an 8-person choir, and we sang a lot of 8-part music, and you had to get there at 7 a.m. on a Sunday, which if you're like 23 years old, feels intense. But it was wonderful. And it was, there were just incredible singers. There was maybe 6 professional singers. Somebody who'd been in Chanticleer. I don't know if you know that group.
No, I do not.
Yeah, it's a wonderful choral music group. And then there was a guy who was in the Justice Department and me. And it was, you meet such a range of people through music. And the other wonderful thing about music is that anywhere you travel, anywhere you move, there are musicians, and you can have an experience with them that transcends a common language. I lived in Kenya for 2 years, and I once went to this very, very, very rural part of Kenya and stayed at a kind of campsite. And there was nobody who spoke Swahili, which I knew a little bit of. Nobody who spoke English, and was having kind of a lot of issues communicating. And then I realized that the Maasai people who were running that campsite were obsessed with Dolly Parton. And so we sat for like 2 hours and we listened to their 2 Dolly Parton albums on a CD. Everyone was singing together. It's an amazing thing. It's an amazing calling card if you want to travel.
Wow. Yeah. So according to your bio, you also played the mandolin. That would be an instrument that I was interested in because of the famous REM song, Losing My Religion.
Yes.
And for a few months, I wanted to learn it, but then I couldn't find either the time nor the, I guess, interest to do so, regrettably. But tell us about learning to play that instrument.
I would love to listen to a podcast of people who had learned instruments as adults. My mom has some adult music students, and it's really hard. It's a different type of learning an instrument than what you do when you're a kid. I picked the mandolin. So the mandolin is strung like the violin. It has the same fifths. It has those strings. So I just thought, oh, that'll make it easier to learn how to play. I wanted to play an instrument where I could accompany myself singing. And I also like country music. It's more, I feel like it's hipper to say like bluegrass, but I actually just like your sort of trashy country music. The lyrics are really wonderful. So kind of storytelling that happens in country music. So I bought a kind of cheap mandolin, and I think it was inhibiting that I could play the violin, oddly, because instead of starting from scratch and learning, you hold it differently, your hand posture is different. I sort of ended up playing it like I was strumming a violin, like a guitar.
Ah.
So, yeah.
Yeah,
But I can't play sort of, I can accompany myself singing. I can play basic stuff and play Bob Dylan songs.
Wow. Yeah, I tried to do that as well. Like when I first started, I tried to play like a guitar, but it's a different instrument. But going back to South Africa, I wonder if you've immersed somewhat in the music scene there. I know that there's a famous hip hop duo, right? Die Antwoord, or The Answer in German.
Oh, Die Antwoord.
Yes, that.
Yes.
So,
I did an article. People can look it up if they Google. Maybe we'll put it in the show notes or something. The name of that duo, and then New York Times, my name. So I did an article, a story on them. There's an incredible musical tradition here that's really unique. There's a very famous song of which there are many, many, many variations, and it's called Daar kom die Alabama, which in Afrikaans means there comes the worship Alabama. And it's actually, the sort of lore goes that it was written to honor a Confederate warship that came and visited Cape Town and had, I think, black staff on it. And there was you get in South Africa a kind of syncretic music with Zulu singing traditions, a cappella harmony traditions, mixed with a kind of coastal, there's a lot of intercourse with other types of world music, even Arab music, New Orleans jazz is like hugely influential. So it's really interesting. It's got a little bit of there's a very, very, very distinctive types of music that come from West Africa. And I would say South Africa is more like a melting pot musically. But the culture is extremely musical. If you go to a funeral here, in different class backgrounds, different races, you'll often find people singing in harmony spontaneously in a way that I never found in Europe, certainly, where there's, unless you're a professional, there's a kind of like uptight, I don't know how it is in Vienna, but.
Yeah, actually, full disclosure, I originally am from Hanoi, Vietnam. I just arrived in Vienna a few days ago to pursue my master's. So it's not like I'm like a resident in this town for a long time.
I see.
But I'm enjoying it so far. Yeah. So,
Do you get in Hanoi, let's say you have a religious kind of holiday or a funeral or something, will people just kind of break out into song in a very kind of lusty way?
That's not been my experience. No. We have, particularly in the rural areas, whatever instrumentals have been replaced by loudspeakers and canned music, as I call it. So
yeah. It was interesting for me as someone who's sung in like choirs with very highly trained people with masters in music, to see a kind of there's a positive and a negative to cultures of professionalism, I think. So on the one hand, when I was living in Washington, in New Haven, we were able to do this incredibly technically advanced 8-part polyphony music. But it also made people like my dad, who wasn't very trained, feel like he couldn't do music. I remember even singing Happy Birthday for him was like, he doesn't have the worst voice, but he just felt so self-conscious because he wasn't trained. And down here in some areas, you have less training from a very early age, but more people feel capacitated to make music, to take part in it.
I see. So I wonder, having been immersed in both American and South African culture, what do you perceive is the biggest difference between the two? You've mentioned that, race plays a very big role in both American and South African psyches, but yeah, what's the big difference that people would notice when they've lived in both cultures again?
Wow. That's a really good question. America kind of prides itself on being very diverse, and in a sense it is, but South Africa has 11 official languages. And unlike some African countries where there would be 1 or 2 dominant languages and then official languages that are sort of included for political reasons, but which, 1% of people would speak, they're really vie with each other. And that gives, I think that there's nobody who feels like they're in a majority in South Africa. And there's many other things that could be different from the US, but in the US and I lived in Belgium briefly, and there was this sense of a tension between Flemish and French speakers, Flanders and Wallonia, and they were kind of like vying for a sense of dominance, a sense of full cultural dominance and power. And you obviously get in the US a kind of search for political dominance where you feel like you're in a corpus or a group that is dominant. Here you just don't, there's not really that capacity. I would say that to some outsiders, South Africa is presented as a Black dominated country, which technically it is, but Black was a category imposed in part by apartheid, by a relatively recent white regime, and you get more, it's a really pluralistic, in a way that I never really understood what that word meant in reality. I never sensed it until I got here. Right. People always have to be kind of, I don't want to say careful, but like you always need allies for anything that you want to do in this country. You can't, you have to depend on others and persuade them.
Right. Yeah, so I'd like to move on to the subject of your fascinating article, which presents a different view than mine on the topic of cancel culture. But since we're talking about music, to incorporate it with the topic of cancel culture, Kanye West has been in the news recently. And, having been a great fan and admirer of his music, I always find myself frustrated and dreading to see, if he's on the news. Like, I would ask myself, oh God, what has he done now? And, as of late, that has been given the worst possible answer. So I guess in the case of Kanye West, how should the ethics of quote unquote cancel culture apply?
I guess that my perspective, so I've written on this actually a number of times for the Atlantic, for the Washington Post. Wouldn't say cancel culture, I hope is my beat, but like I have written on it. And maybe my perspective tends to be that it's a little bit overstated as a general cultural phenomenon, how much it really happens to a kind of wide swath of people. That's not that interesting or that unusual a viewpoint, I think. But another thing that I experienced is that the way that it's described by some people as very pervasive, as terrifying, as you never know who will be next, is itself a suppressant of expression, and itself kind of frightens people and causes a sort of self-censorship and a constriction of what people say. Kanye, I think it's kind of a pity that he's like brought into the cancel culture description, because he does seem, I was talking with my mom and she reminded me that Rachmaninoff dedicated one of his concertos, I think, to his psychiatrist, that he had lifelong struggles with his mental health. And there's this idea that, you know, the most creative people are a little crazy. But I think in that case, she brought it up to sort of point out that at least he felt that in order to be adequately creative, to finish good work, to not just, you know, put out work that existed merely to kind of shock, that he needed to be treated for this. I don't, you know, it's impossible to speculate really on Kanye's internal mindset, but there does seem to be sort of something else going on there. And also, you know, at some point, how do you draw the line? This interests me, between putting out an idea or a piece of work or even a song or whatever that's kind of counterculture and kind of spiky and controversial for interesting reasons, versus just trying to get attention by wearing a White Lives Matter t-shirt.
Yeah, I was going to get at that too. I mean, in the realm of music and artistry, I mean, there are a number of really provocative songs and albums that Mr. West has done, which I adore, and which at the time it was released, like I'll say Jesus is one that it polarized the music industry, and but later on people regard it as a classic. And there's that, obviously, and there's showing up at Paris Fashion Week with Candace Owens wearing that stupidly provocative shirt and hoodie. And, you know, there are good and bad ways to be provocative, and he has chosen, at this time at least, to do it in the worst way possible. So
I don't know what you think of this idea, but I was talking with somebody about virality and the way the concept of virality, even sort of mathematically, impacts art creation. So it's the sense that the sort of reception of your work as an artist depends on an exponential kind of growth of your the attention to the work, as opposed to a more linear one. And I think it tends to kind of make it seem more wise or more efficient to put out something maybe quite shocking that doesn't necessarily reflect, you know, a year, 2 years, 3 years of incremental work and the incremental development of your ideas. You know, some of these songs, even on Yeezus, I think it wasn't like somebody he came up with that in an hour, or if he did, it was the product of years of kind of listening and synthesizing and reflecting. And that has a kind of layeredness that I think is actually crucial to properly boundary breaking at the vanguard controversial work, as opposed to kind of, you're sitting in a brainstorming session with a publicist and you come up, in 5 minutes with something that you hope is going to have an exponential way of impacting people. And then you get this very reductive, superficial, where maybe you just turn something literally on its head. You take a very common saying and you swap the races or whatever. And yeah, so I guess maybe, I was trying to think, other than just saying it's impossible to make any rule for what distinguishes pointless controversial work from really good controversial work. I was just trying to think of what's a formula by which we could think about what separates those.
Yeah.
Because I agree that Kanye has done some very provocative, incredible stuff, but that not everything that he does that's provocative has any real content.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Kanye West has a history of being needlessly provocative, which has been detrimental to his music, which is genuinely amazing. And when I think of virality as someone who's spent way too much time on the internet these days, who actually grew up on it, I think that it is almost always an accident. You cannot manufacture something that is guaranteed to go viral. And if something that you've created that accidentally went viral, you cannot create it again. And, it's a lightning in a bottle thing. So I'd like to move on to, again, the topic of cancel culture, because the way I see it, it also works at very accidental in that, I know that conservatives are a lot more, concerned about cancel culture than liberals. And I can understand that, because it's generally conservatives who, especially in the age of Trump, who are shunned for being, supportive or sympathetic of the former president. But at least in the realm of social media, it is always the most extreme views on both the left and the right which are elevated, while some of the more moderate views that somehow, that trip under some tripwires, say race, sex, or gender, it was suppressed. In this show, I interviewed a woman in Canada who had her Twitter account banned because she asserts that, biological men cannot be real women, speaking on the trans women stuff, which is, a universally accepted point of view, but she was canceled. But of course, President Donald Trump, before he was canceled on Twitter, spoke some incredibly provocative and controversial and extreme views on almost everything. So cancel culture works, but it works in a very disproportionate manner, and it doesn't really target any group or any individual specifically. So I wonder if you share that observation.
Yeah, somebody was talking to me about the dictatorial regime in Zimbabwe. And because I had traveled to Harare to do a story, and people seemed very afraid, and yet acknowledged that in general, there was not that much of a police presence on the street, as opposed to, I was in Moscow maybe 10 years ago, and felt much more policed, even parts of the US. And somebody described the regime as having a mechanism of arbitrary governance, and that arbitrary governance can cause a great deal of terror and anxiety, even if it doesn't imprison that many people. But there's an arbitrariness to who, some people will be doing the same kind of crime, mild crime for years, and then couple of people, you just never, there's never a sense that you're in a system that has rules. And I think probably cancel culture can feel that way. My family was conservative, politically conservative when I grew up, and kind of embedded in conservative media to some degree, especially. So the conservative anger in the US, the conservative sort of agitas about cancel culture, I find a little frustrating because when I was in high school, my early 20s, I found it so censorious, the right side of things. Just, there were kids of people my parents knew who kind of became a bit lefty in college, and then they weren't invited to like Thanksgiving anymore. I mean, there was a real intense, it was almost like Fiddler on the Roof. The youngest child wants to marry a goy, like that marry outside the faith. And it just produces this kind of horror. And so when people on the right say the left is treating kind of political morality like a religion, and, you have to obey its precepts, I'm almost like you kind of recognize that behavior because it used to be so deeply embedded on the right in the US. I guess the question is, these places like Twitter and publications, how much are they public goods? How much are they public squares? I often think of the Atlantic magazine, which began as an abolitionist magazine. And it just, the idea that in the 1850s in the US, that it, for the sake of free speech and diversity of viewpoints, that they should have run pro-slavery or pro-states' rights, or even compromise with the South, articles just would have felt absurd. It was a publication that had its ethos and that had its mission. It had absolutely no obligation to run the views. And, I think if one of its editors, went in a really pro-states' rights, pro-slavery direction, that person would have left. Because, I still don't understand why the New York Times has to run conservatives. I don't understand on some level. It's different a little bit with Twitter just because of how big it's gotten. But I'm not sure why it has to entertain everybody, because it's a kind of a platform whose leaders have a viewpoint. I've never had someone explain to me really clearly why the New York Times has to run editorials by Republicans. Why?
Mm-hmm.
I don't know.
I do understand that, the Times these days, which I don't read with much frequency, has published columnists and editorials from people of the right, say, Ross Douthat, David Brooks, Brad Stevens, among many. I think, this is a confession of mine. I've only started reading The Atlantic for a month ago because, again, I myself identify as a conservative, and I've heard many things about, The Atlantic posting or publishing very liberal-leaning articles, and I've convinced that that's not a place where I should read. But I've previously followed a lot of I guess right-wing or right-leaning media outlets, which I've had to unsubscribe because of their January the 6th apology, and so and then I discovered that The Atlantic does have a pretty reasoned conservative voices, and as well as reasoned liberal voices, and I'd like to listen to the reasoned voices from both sides rather than just the mixture of reason and unreasoned voices from one side only. So there's that. But I've read much of Matthew Continetti's book, The Right, and I understand why there is a market for right-wing media, as you call it, because they perceive that the mainstream media is not only not friendly to the right. You can be not friendly to right-wing views and still invite right-wing people to discuss them. They perceive it as exclusionary. Yeah, the mainstream media has excluded right-wing voices. So things like the Rush Limbaugh show or Fox News were created to accommodate these right-wing voices, but eventually they've grown so big that they have become a kind of mainstream media. So the critics of mainstream media by the right just makes no sense these days.
I think they perceived it as not only exclusionary, or not even mainly like not even principally necessarily exclusionary, but as contemptuous. Even if magazines like the New Yorker, well, I don't know that the New Yorker actually ever runs a right-wing person, but the New York Times, they'll run Bret Stephens, or the Washington Post used to have Krauthammer.
Yeah.
That overall the mode is contemptuous. Something that's discussed a lot in South Africa is how this is going to be an imprecise analogy, but how Black South Africans transition from feeling for a very, very long time like they were in the terrible minority in terms of power, in terms of the public square, newspapers. Certainly the parliament had a kind of sham wing for like people of color, but it really, wasn't real. How they and a kind of identity based on a sense of yourself as oppressed, as ignored, as disempowered, as struggling kind of heroically to kind of gain your foothold and resist being crushed. How you transition from that to really understanding and acknowledging that you hold the public majority and that you are in power. Because the self-perception and the self-concept I've found here, and it drags behind the reality. And I feel that there's this way in which that's true in the US, that certainly under Clinton, even coming off of Reagan, but there was the feeling that in a lot of public spaces that sort of liberalism and melting pot and cosmopolitanism and economic neoliberalism, whatever, it was kind of like the obvious way. I even think of the idea of the coming Democratic majority demographically, that as the US changed demographically, the right would just turn into a rump, right? Like a kind of sad. And my perception in growing up on the right in the 90s in the US was that the sense of yourself as kind of on the back foot and struggling for relevance and struggling against the contemptuous, oppressive, sort of dominant left got so deep into the identity of the right that even when Trump became president, I found that people I knew who voted for Trump, they almost had a hard time acknowledging that he was president because he needed to be still victimized and chased and hated. And I was like, this guy's sitting in the Oval Office. But so there's a tension on the right, I think. And I find that in cancel culture too, where there can be a way of describing the dominance of the mainstream media that really ignores the fact that more people watch Fox than MSNBC, that that right-wing radio has incredible reach. I think it's an interesting moment for the right.
Yeah, it is.
Or conservatism,
Mhm.
which is, not always the same thing.
Right. My identification, I think I'm less of a right winger now than I used to be because, of course, so when I hear voices from the right saying that, the left does this to us and, cancel culture and victimhood and all that, I discovered that whatever malady or pathology that the right ascribes to the left, they practice basically the same kind of malady slash pathology in their own circles. For example, say victimhood, the right would say that, Black people and minorities see themselves as victims of, the oppressive white regime and whatnot. The rhetoric can be a bit too much, but on the right, again, even if when you have a president, Trump always says that, hey, the media always makes himself to be a scapegoat or turns that, and whenever the media attacks him, Donald Trump in classic populist fashion would say that, oh, they're not really attacking me, they're attacking you for supporting me because I'm a force of change in the corrupt, swampy system and all that. And to your point about cancel culture, there's a phenomenon of college campuses not platforming or not allowing right-wing speakers to speak, but there's also that phenomenon which you said about conservative families not allowing different viewpoints in their dinner table or not allowing their children to marry someone based on their political views. And so, that's how, that's when I realized I have to measure my views a bit.
Yeah, I remember my mother has said to me a few times, of all the things I could have ever imagined, because I'm her only child, I wondered, would you maybe, because we're Jewish, would you marry outside Judaism? What would that mean? Be a little tough, but I'd have to figure it out. But I never ever imagined that I would give birth to a liberal. She's like maybe like a third joking, but not completely.
Yeah. My own parents would say that, they are both pretty liberal cosmopolitan people, and so they would be somewhat disappointed for giving birth to a conservative.
Right.
There you go. But let's move on to the topic of your book. Is titled The Inheritors, and the subtitle is An Intimate Portrait of South Africa's Racial Reckoning. It was obviously written by an American and a white American at that. So do prepare for cancel culture to come to you, and be prepared to, I guess, kiss your writing career goodbye. So before that happens, tell us what the book is about.
It's funny because this most recent Atlantic article I wrote is about the warnings that I got to run into a lot of trouble. And it's one of those things where you never know if you're blacklisted, but I really didn't. I really didn't get the skepticism or the kind of dismissive skepticism, just dismiss you that I'd been warned that I would get. So yeah, the book, it's one of the most fascinating countries I've ever spent time in, South Africa, dealing with a very archetypal very, very archetypal type of power change that I think a lot of countries imagine that they're undergoing, like a reversal of fortune, a sort of, there's a lot of what I can feel is quite hyperbolic rhetoric in a lot of places, that within the next 6 months, the American democracy will convert to an absolute fascist regime, that you get this sort of switch to the opposite. And it's funny, I mean, South Africa actually did really experience that in a sense, in that they went from a type of extremely fastidiously prosecuted racial hierarchy. It had this almost absurdism to it. It was taken so far, and it was done, that happened for like local reasons. But for instance, I believe that people who lived in South Africa or who came there of Chinese or Vietnamese or Thai or South Asian heritage were designated colored, quote unquote. Yeah. But Japanese, people of Japanese heritage were white, or they were honorary white. Yes. You know, my husband is of Greek heritage, and they almost got streamed to the Greek South Africans to colored, but then because of shipping, needing to maintain relationships with Greece, they became white. It's all very crazy. So this, and even in the late 80s, it was illegal to have sex with someone of the other race. This was policed, kind of network of telling on people. You couldn't own a business really of any kind as a person of color, almost. And then that transitioned in the space of a decade to a country who's with a Black president, a Black dominated, totally Black dominated parliament, Black newspaper editors. It's just a absolutely kind of astonishing thing. And I felt like it was both kind of just interesting in and of itself, but that it also, I don't quite know how to put it, had an iconic or archetypal quality of a kind of power overturn that was very fascinating, kind of a test case. And I found overall that the reactions and the feelings of Black South Africans, of different classes, of white liberals in particular, sort of people who had been at some cost to themselves progressive whites under apartheid, that how they reacted to this and their feelings over time and how they grappled with it were totally not what I had expected, and very, very counterintuitive. I mean, you get a real move to the right, for instance, among white left liberals, almost correlating to the degree to which the society became more like what they had hypothetically argued for. And then there was a recoil against that. So I really try to bring out all that. It's a very psychological book, I would say. It follows 4 people primarily who are real, who I spent a lot of time with. And I wanted to also give it my favorite writer is Tolstoy. And I wanted it to have a fiction-like weight and quality, and to really be a kind of absorbing psychological read about humans who could be anywhere. And so I actually wrote it 3 times, once chronologically, once by person, sort of dividing up, and once by theme, because I wanted it to both have a kind of novel, like a real chronology, how these people's lives really unfolded, but I also wanted there to be a thematic development and the development of certain arguments and counter arguments across the book.
Mm-hmm. So I read that not long after you came to South Africa in 2010, there is a white nationalist or Afrikaner, neo-Nazi type, Eugene Terre Blanche, French for White Earth. He was brutally murdered at that time, and he represented this nasty backlash against the end of apartheid or minority rule. But psychologically, I think he was obviously a condemnable human being. But I wonder if the white South African population, the Afrikaners, the Boers, as they call themselves, when they when they saw that, they will never be in having substantial political power ever again, that is I guess that is one of the effects of the end of apartheid.
Ever again. Yeah. I mean,
Yeah.
that's a real big difference. They're not gonna come back into power. So
I wonder if an anxiety over the sudden powerlessness of their position is felt in, I guess, the white population of South Africa. And secondly, South Africa being a more liberal society than most African countries at the moment have, have enshrined a protection of minorities. But I wonder if the conflict between, say, the idea that minorities should be protected and the history that, historically, this particular minority has held all the powers, and now, they deserve some sort of sanctions for having done so, persists in South African society.
yeah, there's, there was an absolute rupturing of identity in a way that I think was not anticipated by anybody, the degree of the rupture. And looking back, you can understand it, because basically at its base, the justification for people to have any kind of disproportionate economic power or political power ever in sub-Saharan Africa, but in South Africa, was that they would run things better or run things well. And, the end of apartheid in South Africa brought with it a kind of collapse of any historical honor for white rule, even kind of retroactively. So now, the history books will go back and say that all really sucked. And so I think there is a real anxiety of how do we continue to justify our sort of existence here? How do we understand who we are? How do we understand who we were? And it's very comprehensive. There's a beautiful writer named Donnie Murray, an Afrikaner writer, who wrote a wonderful article, or he's a poet, but about how his memories of his first kiss as a teenager are really tainted, because he has to remember that they happened under apartheid, and that he sort of permitted himself to have any element of a normal life and any pleasure. And he looks back with guilt, but also, those memories and that past is kind of ruined retroactively. I wrote another Atlantic article about this and about, different people's reactions. There's a group that kind of came about in South Africa. It's an NGO, and it's dedicated to protecting the interest of Afrikaners in South Africa. And they really have tried to create a new understanding of Afrikaners, constitute about 60% of white South Africans, but they ran the apartheid regime as a minority, as a, the head of this organization said to me, he had the phrase that we're a discredited minority, but a minority nonetheless. And it's complex, because there's never going to be an Afrikaner president again of South Africa, I'm almost sure. And yet there is still a lingering legacy of real disproportionate economic power among white South Africans. So how do you really understand that group? Do you understand it solely politically, economically, or a third way that I think is important, which is how do people perceive their future, and what does it mean to be in a group that's still privileged, but that only sees a possible trajectory of decline? So.
I see. So you've mentioned visiting Zimbabwe before, and of course, that country's history is also interesting because before Zimbabwe, it was called Rhodesia, and
Yeah.
the closest parallel to what apartheid South Africa is the unrecognized country of Rhodesia, where it had a white only parliament and government, and the president was Ian Smith, and it was a white British man, and Black people were essentially disenfranchised. But the collapse of Rhodesia brought about a brutal dictatorship under Robert Mugabe, which lasted for decades. And so I wonder if South Africa, the post-apartheid South Africa, how do its people and its government, as in both blacks and whites, how do they work to not make the same mistake as Rhodesia/Zimbabwe?
On the one hand, I don't think that Zimbabwe's actually very relevant to South Africa, except that there are a lot of Zimbabwean refugees here. But the sort of economies, the demographics, the history is really, really, really different. Zimbabwe has a very different and somewhat unfortunate arbitrary tribal makeup in that it does have a dominant tribe. These borders were drawn arbitrarily. So it had the misfortune of being a country that was created with very, very unfortunate tribal balance. It wasn't due to the tribes themselves. It was due to the kind of colonial boundaries. And they also had a very different, the white regime was in a way in Zimbabwe more extractive while being a tiny bit less brutal, but they were less interested in even pretending that they ran the country particularly well. And they created a real severe economic bubble that was already, they just gave a poison chalice to the inheritor, who also happened to be bad. And yet I find South Africa very, officials that I speak to, the public discourse, very kind of frightened by the example of Zimbabwe. It's interesting to me because it makes me think of, how are other countries in ways that I don't perceive as an American frightened by the example of Trump or inspired by it or whatever. But South Africa undertakes quite a few, its policy environment is quite constrained by the example of its next door neighbor. Types of land reform that actually the country could use a freer conversation about, because there's still a lot of landlessness and people crowded on these very poor lands, and not necessarily a conversation about expropriation without compensation, but somehow how to do a mentorship, how to just transform this rural landscape a little bit faster. Those conversations don't happen because people have gotten a terrible fright from Zimbabwe. So I would say it's a very negative example without necessarily having to be one. And I think probably whatever problems exist in South Africa currently are very subjective. They're very much a matter of interpretation. Many people who are very smart very firmly believe that the country is much too sort of neoliberal or kind of beholden to big corporations that are still run by whites or whatever. And they really are serious people who really believe that. Then you get people who are very serious and sincere, and they believe the country is much too socialist. So, and yet there's a kind of, I don't know if you watched the show Squid Game.
Yes, I do.
Yeah, like I think of that bridge where, people are so panicked and they're trying to shove someone else ahead and trying to hyper analyze. You just don't want to move. You're because you feel like you're going to literally ruin your country, which is the example of next door. I mean, the country is in a state where it's hard to see what could fix it.
Yeah. So a final question. I understand that, given what I've known about South Africa, there are problems which it suffers, which the US, it doesn't really. For example, rolling blackouts. You've already mentioned it before we begin this program.
Yeah.
And I watched that Louis Theroux documentary about the lawlessness problem in Johannesburg and how they had to hire basically private security, which are just a bunch of marauders to protect themselves, which is a kind of protection racket. But nevertheless, I think the example of racial reconciliation that the country has undertaken since 1994, I believe, when Mandela was elected, it has some flaws and setbacks, particularly recently, but it has provided a good model for how a previously very racially segregated regime can be, desegregated and without much in terms of brutal violence. And even though Black people received enfranchisement in South Africa much later than the US, that was in 1964, I believe, the process, from my observation, has been much quicker and steadier and involve less bloodshed. So I guess my question now to you is, at least in the realm of racial reckoning, what can the US learn from South Africa?
I appreciate that question because it's true. I do think that if one looks at where South Africa was in, let's say, 1991, 92, it had, the statistics is a little unclear, but it's believed to have had by far, the world's highest murder rate. And that was political violence just prior to the end of apartheid, different sort of factions within Black communities, white police killing, and far higher than any Latin American country. And given what was predicted for the country, where I talked to a lot of diplomats who had worked here in the 80s, and they said, I hated apartheid, but I didn't know how to undo it because it seemed to me that there would be so much pain, so much anger, so much resentment, so much lack of skills. It would be impossible, and the country would descend into civil war. And I would say of the fan of like possible trajectories that could have happened after 94, South Africa is probably at 80-85%. And so there is a lot to learn from it. I'm not sure that, it would be great to have a different conversation about, and I'm not sure everyone will agree with what I feel the lessons are. I think that in a lot of cases, while being extremely controversial, and here that affirmative action did good things. I think that there was a perception that also had to do with reality, that Black people were less competent just because they had less opportunities to go to university, to become skilled, whatever. And that perception had to be kind of broken by preferential hiring, I think that it was time bound. It was like there was a sunset on it, but there was a period of affirmative action that didn't last forever, but that was meant to accomplish something specific. And that really did, I think. I think the country has an understanding that a period like this is not going to feel good to everyone. It's not going to be flawless. I find that especially in the United States, but in some other societies, there's a kind of unarticulated feeling that the society should be very close to an ideal, however anyone sees it. There's a lot of emotive compromise here, and a sense that, okay, we're going to have to go through a period that might be weird and might be unideal for anybody, and kind of have that. I also think the leadership of Mandela and of Tutu really stressed, and it's too bad because that leadership has that there isn't someone here like that right now, but those leaders really stressed how to find the positive, even in a situation that feels really far from ideal for anybody, which was the case in the 1990s. You had this loss of power for white people and not an immediate gain of it. A lot of Black people's lives didn't change immediately. It was very tough for people. But, I sometimes wish we had leaders, it's going to sound weird, but who said, instead of just wishing certain features of modern societies away, like polarization, saying, what purpose could this serve? Why has this arisen? Instead of just expecting everyone to become different overnight. The last thing I'll say is the country has an incredible and very unique sense of humor, which you see in Trevor Noah, which it really punches above its weight humor-wise. And you would not think that a country with as devastating a history, where you had a president who had been imprisoned for 27 years on an island, effectively in solitary, would be really funny, but it is. And there's an example that'll be odd. I don't think that it has applications everywhere, but there were some political riots last year in South Africa over the actual imprisonment of an ex-president, Jacob Zuma. And there was some political violence that occurred. Some people compared it to January 6th. I don't think it was really the same at all. But it was in one area. And somehow South Africans are able to hold simultaneously that it was shocking and it cannot be repeated. But also, there were some very funny, I have to say funny, like shows and sketches that came out of that. There's a guy, for instance, who there was some looting. I don't know, it's hard to describe outside of South Africa, and he was trying to fit an enormous TV into a tiny Toyota Corolla. And he went about this for like 20 minutes and he had this calm look. I don't know, South Africans just found it so distinctive and so funny. Somebody said to me, we can laugh at something that we feel that we have survived. So maybe, I think, you may have talked about humor when you're talking about cancel culture and the lack thereof or whatever, but there's a way in which a society is able to find something funny once it also feels that it's made a kind of collective decision. That was a really bad idea. Let's not do that again. And then we find it funny. And I sometimes wonder if it's sort of when people talk about the decline of humor in the US, if part of what we're really talking about is that we can't make any collective decision that something wasn't a good era, wasn't a good president, wasn't a good invasion of the Capitol, didn't turn out as, that was not good. We're going to move beyond it, and then it can become really funny. South Africa does that in a way that I think is worth learning from.
I see. Well, I guess here's the real final question, since you are writing a book and you publish a book about South Africa's post-apartheid legacy, and I wonder if you would recommend any books written pre or post-apartheid about that particular situation. I'm thinking, Alan Paton's Cry the Beloved Country, or the novel that was adapted into a movie with Marlon Brando, A Dry White Season. Are they worth reading?
A Dry White Season, I don't know. Isn't that set? That might be set in Zimbabwe. But there's an incredible book by a writer named Rian Malan called My Traitor's Heart. That is just an astonishing piece of writing. It's about, and I think it feels kind of perpetually relevant to a lot of people because it's written right before the end of apartheid, when you have a person who's facing what feels like a turning point, a kind of precipice politically. That is an incredible book. So a writer named Eusebius McKaiser, I'll write you his name. He's an essayist. There's a lot of South Africans who are great on Twitter. The local publishing industry is okay, but it's not as robust as the one in the UK or other parts of Europe or India. So you actually get a lot of writers who do really great work in segments and long threads on Twitter. There's a woman named Ridi Tlabi who I recommend following. Eusebius is a really great Twitter follow. There's a writer named Bonacile. I'll write these to you. Maybe we can put them in the comments. I would also say, I'm going to contradict what I said about Zimbabwe. There's a Zimbabwean writer named Tsitsi Dangarembga who just was nominated for a Booker, I think a year ago, prize. And she's done 2 books that she likes, and they're both wonderful. And they're set in Rhodesia, one's in Rhodesia, one's set in the new Zimbabwe, set in Harare, the capital. And they give an impression of the post-colony that also relates to South Africa, I think.
All right.
Yeah.
Yeah. And on that note, thank you very much, Eve Fairbanks, for being on this show and for sharing us her fascinating thoughts on cancel culture as well as South Africa.
Oh, District 9. It's a fantastic movie. Did you see it?
Yeah, I should see that. It's a pretty famous one. It's
so good, and it really will give you an allegorical flavor of South Africa, but it's like, it's not boring political movie. It's so good. It's really fantastic.
Yeah, of course, I would recommend your book, The Inheritors, on the racial reckoning in South Africa, as well as your Atlantic article on the misconceptions of cancel culture. So thank you very much. I hope that for the time being, you're not canceled for your book or any of your writings, and take good care of yourself.
Thank you. Thanks. Great to join you.